So a little boy was out in his front yard. He was throwing a ball up in the air when an elderly woman passed by and asked him, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm having catch with God. I throw the ball up to God, and God throws it right back down." Now, it is a scientific fact that everything that goes up must come down. But it's also a profound spiritual truth. And that's what I want to look at today. Because in the spiritual life, there are two movements. There's the movement up, and there's the movement down. What our tradition talks about as the journey of ascent in the spirit and the journey of descent into the soul. And they're both important. And we see evidence of both of these journeys throughout the Scriptures. And the journey of ascent in the Spirit is one that often leads to a sense of the transcendence of God, and it can be incredibly healing to have those mountaintop experiences. While the journey of descent into the soul is one where more wholing takes place, more integration happens, and this is also an important part of the spiritual life. So I want to look at these two movements. Not only as individuals we experience this, but I think as a community of faith we have these experiences as well. I want to do so in light of the biblical witness as a whole, but also looking at these two scriptures today. And in this sermon, I'm going to share two stories from my ministry. First, a story that we experienced, many of us together, and a story I experienced in my previous community that I served. But as you listen to these stories, I encourage you to pay attention to your own life, your own experience, listening for those moments where you have had that journey of ascent experience or that journey of descent. So let's begin. The journey of ascent in the Spirit leading us towards healing and transcendence is the first movement, or one of the two movements of the Spirit. And in today's text, the Lord says to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain," which is Mount Sinai, "and wait for me," he says. Now, Mount Sinai is also known in the Old Testament as Mount Horeb. So it is the same mountain that God had called Elijah to walk up to previously in the Old Testament. So on this mountain, Moses experienced the burning bush and God speaking to him through the burning bush. He also receives the law and the Ten Commandments, and as we heard about earlier today. But it's also the place where Elijah experiences God in the sound of sheer silence. So today's New Testament text makes a whole lot more sense when we understand the context of the mountain. For who is it that appears to Peter, James, and John but Moses and Elijah, the two great prophets in the Jewish tradition? So there is Jesus standing in this prophetic tradition with Moses and Elijah, and for a moment the disciples see Jesus in a new way. And they realize that this teacher, this rabbi, is a little bit more than what appears. God says to them, "Listen to him. This is my son." And they begin to start to put it together that maybe Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ of all creation, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. Have you ever had a mountaintop experience? Have you ever had an experience that you just can't put your finger on, when the veil was parted and you saw something of the mystery or the glory of God and it was transcendent? Maybe it was an experience that happened years ago, but you still remember it clearly, even today. And in some way it has shaped your life and continues to shape it. An experience of the transcendent that was so powerful that you felt like it lifted you up, it inspired you, it empowered you in a way that almost nothing else in your life has done. And an experience that strangely was healing. Perhaps it healed you from the tyranny of your doubt or your fear, or maybe your hurt or your shame or your guilt or your addiction. Some experience that you look to. Well, I had an experience like that right here on Easter Sunday, probably standing a little further. I was preaching my first Easter sermon as your pastor, and I was preaching on how the beloved disciple got to the resurrection before Peter, who always represents the church. Anytime we hear Peter, we know that he represents the church. And so the point of the sermon was that the church is at its best when it follows love's lead, as Peter was following the beloved disciple to the resurrection. And while I was outdoors after the service, I was greeting people between the two services, and one of you pointed to the cornerstone outside, which I had walked by many times but had never really looked at. And there it was, the cornerstone of the new building, which said Easter 2006. It was like a gut blow. I realized that the next Easter was going to be the 10th anniversary. And I had just come from a church that had a 50th anniversary, which was way over the top, and it kind of left this taste in my mouth. And I was like, man, I got to lead a 10th anniversary of a new building. And I got to be honest, I wasn't excited about it. But I committed to praying about it, finding a way that we could celebrate that felt right, that didn't amount to us patting ourselves on the back. So I invited people to pray with me. I invited the staff to come up with ideas. And then one night on Thanksgiving weekend, I was woken up right out of the blue with a phrase, 10 times 10. And it hit me so clearly that one of the ways we could celebrate our 10th anniversary is to raise $10,000 for every year that we've been in our building and then give the money away to our mission partners. At first, I thought that's just too crazy an idea, and I dismissed it, but it was gently persistent, and I began to put pen to paper. And eventually, I put together a written proposal, and I sent it to the session to be discussed at our December meeting. Now, the December meeting is the meeting where we vote on the budget. All right? And it's also the meeting where a third of the elders will be done after that meeting. So you can imagine they're sitting there counting the minutes. And this meeting is going on and on and on. 9:30 has come and gone, and I haven't even had an opportunity to present this proposal. It was dead on arrival, and I knew it. But I went with my gut feeling, and I put it out there. I said, it's late, but I shared this proposal, so let's talk about it. And we had a really good substantive conversation. And there were really smart people on both sides. People were saying, it just feels like a little bit too much of a stretch. We've just increased our giving, and I don't know that we can ask the congregation to give anymore. And then there was another group saying, man, it's crazy, but this could be the right time. We've always been a missional congregation, and we haven't been able to give the last decade or so the way that we'd like to. And so we went on and on. It was a really good discussion. I didn't know whether to punt and maybe pick another meeting to vote on this. But finally, there was a little bit of a pause, and I said, are you ready to vote on this 10 times 10 campaign? And I got the sense that they were. I said, it's getting late. And then I hit my little phone, and sure enough, as we were calling this to vote, it was 10:10 p.m. And I felt like a charge just go through me. And there was a charge through that whole campaign, those of you that were here. It was really remarkable. You all not only raised $100,000, we raised $143,000, which we gave away. And I think it was a turning point in our journey because it got back to what we love to do, which is to help other people after a period of time where we had to learn how to receive other people's help. These mountaintop experiences have a certain magic about them. And in the end, these aren't what ministry is about. They really aren't. And in fact, they're rare. And I think it's a good thing because they can feed the ego, these mountaintop experiences. And we can use them to justify all kinds of power games and superiority trips. And in many ways, I think mountaintop experiences are like falling head over heels in love with somebody. They're great to get things going, to get us started on the path to marriage, but How many of you have been sustained in your marriage by that falling in love experience? It doesn't have the power to sustain a marriage. We need something deeper to come alongside those experiences on the mountaintop. Scottish theologian Henry Drummond puts it this way. He said, God does not make the mountaintops for us to live on. We only ascend to the heights to catch a broader vision of the earthly surroundings below. We don't live there. The streams begin in the uplands, but they descend quickly to gladden the valleys below. And what happens in our biblical text for today? Well, Moses comes down the mountain. And he goes into the valley to lead a difficult people through the wilderness wanderings towards a promised land that Moses himself will never enter. And what happens to Peter, James, and John? Well, they come down a mountain, and the first person they encounter is an epileptic boy having a seizure and a distraught father, and then they hear difficult, challenging words from Jesus telling them they need to have more faith, deeper faith. And what happens to Jesus? Well, Matthew tells us he begins his long descent into the valley to Jerusalem towards what will be his crucifixion. There are two movements. There's the movement up, a movement of ascent into the Spirit that leads us towards healing and integration, or healing and transcendence. And there is the movement of descent into the soul, leading us to wholing, which is Bill Plotkin's beautiful phrase, and integration. Now, there are countless metaphors in the Bible for this part of the journey. There is the cave, the exodus, the exile, the belly of the great fish. There's the wilderness, there's the desert, there's silence. And while healing is about transcending our problems, relieving ourselves of our symptoms, establishing healthier practices so we can become more than we can imagine ourselves becoming, all of which is really, really good, wholing is about embracing our brokenness, our woundedness. It's about weaving together or having woven together the fragments of our lives and our past. It's about integrating the shadow parts that we don't often want to see. It's about bringing forth this hidden wholeness, what we call the soul, which needs to be nurtured forth in order to be born and embodied in our lives. Descent is about the soul. Not only our individual souls, but I think our collective soul. I think every community has a soul. We might call that our DNA, our essence, who we are at our deepest. And this soul is created by God. It belongs to God, and it is not controlled by our own ego or our will. I think the words that God speaks to Jesus are the words that God speaks to every one of our souls and the soul of this community, which is, "This is my beloved, and I love you, and I have created you." Listen to the soul. This is the light that shines in the darkness that the darkness cannot put out. We see that light in Jesus, but Jesus sees that light in us. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, we don't tend to get to that place without suffering in our lives. And that's why the ego doesn't like the journey of descent. It loves the journey of ascent because it likes to co-opt that journey for its own purposes, and it uses it to justify it being in charge. But it can't do that, it won't do that, and it doesn't do that with the journey of descent. Because in order to do that, it would have to willingly participate in its own demotion. And our ego will not ever do that. You see, the valley has power that the mountaintop doesn't. The valley can lead us into our soul and the soul of our community. Have you ever had an experience of descent? Has there been a time in your life when you found yourself in the belly of the big fish, kicking and screaming, being led somewhere you didn't want to go? Have you ever found yourself in the wilderness, wandering around, looking for food, looking for drink, thirsty and hungry, learning how to rely upon God in a way that you never had to before? Have you ever experienced what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, when it was dark, and yet God was able to do something in the darkness that you would have never allowed to happen in the light of day? I think as a community, you have had two of these experiences in just a couple decades. In 2002, many of you experienced the fire, and all of us have been walking through this collective wilderness these past 2 years. And while experiences of ascent feel like we're being lifted up, drawn forward, inspired, and empowered, experiences of descent feel like we're being torn apart and put back together again in a new way in the dark by hands other than our own. It's as if our hands are being moved off the steering wheel so that another's hands can take the wheel and lead us where we don't want to go. Have you ever had an experience of descent where when you look back on it, you see how it worked? How God was able to do something in retrospect that you may not have been aware of as you were living in it, and God was able to bring forth something in you that was dormant, that was near dead, but now is being brought back to life. Did you ever have an experience that was like labor pains, and you realized, man, was that difficult, but something was born that was new and beautiful, and it's glorious? Have you ever discovered through experiences of descent that you became more rooted deeply in Christ, in your soul, in your calling, in your divine DNA? Well, let me close with an experience of descent that has stayed with me and shapes me even today. It occurred a week after 9/11. And I was serving at the time in Chatham Township. And Chatham Township got hit hard, just like you did here in Ridgewood. A lot of people died. It was tragic. And we had many worship services. And for a brief period of time, we realized how much we need each other. And by noon on Friday, 3 days after that fateful Tuesday, I was leading a noon worship service. And the choir director was depleted and desperate, asked me to sing a song. I was singing this song, and I locked eyes with this woman, and looking into her eyes was like looking into the darkness, into the void of hurt and fear, panic, terror. And I couldn't get that face out of my mind. Even as I was greeting people afterwards, and as I was driving home, I could not get her face out of my mind. It was haunting me. And the only thing I could do when I got home was to get into my bed, curl into the fetal position, and I wept like a baby, retching tears coming forth. And as I was crying, I heard footsteps outside my bedroom window, somebody walking to the front door, and I remember praying to God, no, I can't. I have nothing left. I don't want to see anybody. I can't help anyone. And I waited for that doorbell to ring. And it didn't. And then I heard footsteps walk back down the steps. I heard a car door open and close and a car pull down the driveway. And I continued to cry. And then I finally got up and I went to the front door to see what had happened. And I saw there on the steps a home-cooked meal with a handwritten note. It said, even a shepherd needs to be fed. And I can't help but think that's what's going on in this text today. Jesus knows where it's going. He's trying to tell the disciples what's about to happen, and they can't hear it, as we can't hear the wisdom of the journey of descent. We can't hear it. The ego won't allow it. And in that moment, I think God feeds Jesus the Good Shepherd. He gives Jesus this experience of communion with the prophet Elijah and Moses, and all we know is they have this deep conversation. And then Jesus hears the blessing of his Father. You're my guy. I love you. And then he says to them, listen to this guy. And he's fed in that moment. So wherever we are, if you are in the journey of ascent, enjoy it. It's beautiful. Let it touch you and inspire you. But most of our life, we're in this journey of descent. And maybe the invitation for all of us, even particularly now when nothing is as we want it to be, it really isn't. Maybe even now, we need to learn how to trust that journey of descent into the soul, where that holing work can happen and God can pull together pieces of our lives and our collective life that we, by our own power, could never do. May our faith deepen, and may we learn to trust God wholeheartedly, even and especially when it's hard. Amen.